important that we all understand each national government will continue forever to be very important stakeholder and key player in conservation. But second point, what I believe governments tend to forget is that they are not alone in this equation. The next most important key player, if not the most important, is members of communities. These are the communities that are surrounding these conserved areas. Some of them are shared ecosystem from one country to the other. Some of them are solo within individual countries. For example, we do have here in Kenya the Greater Serengeti shared with Mara. And you have members of those communities actually actively involved in not only being part of the conservation, but also beneficiaries in terms of what comes out of conservation. So that brings the equation of sustainable conservation. One of the greatest forgotten part of this conservation effort is the Greater Selous. Selous Game Reserve in Tanzania, 55,000 square kilometers, is the largest anywhere in the world. It is bordering the Niassa Game Reserve, which is 40,000 square kilometers, also second largest in the world. So you have these major ecosystems that have enormous porous borders among themselves, the southern part of Tanzania and northern part of Mozambique. So you have enormous poaching problem. Yeah. What you need to see is more effort by the government of Tanzania and Mozambique working together, but also stakeholders involving the communities and private sector interested in investing in those areas, both in ecologies and also community involved activities that can be part of this conservation equation. My point here is that members of community become more involved when they can benefit on something. Right. Government need to understand that when you think of the sustainability in the equation of conservation, one, you have to understand it must continue to provide for livelihood. Yeah. And how do we do that? This is the partnership equation we are discussing. Right.
The partnership equation, which is very significant, you mentioned. Do you feel a sense that most governments have, especially those dealing with the hospitality industry, have forgotten or they have just kept themselves occupied or preoccupied with working on tourist numbers, as opposed to what can tourism do to actually change the lives of the communities around those areas where we are putting these facilities?
Myself, having been one of the members of the government, I believe mistakenly government continue to consider what they can get, what is there for me. So they continue to raise taxes, focusing on the tourist numbers coming in, how much are they going to pay, what is there for us in terms of more and more taxation, even taxing the conservation efforts that usually are the reason for sustainability. I think what needs to happen, I think across the board, and we are speaking to a number of governments, is for policymakers to consider, one, conservation by itself requires investment from the government. It is like creating a road, building an airline where people can pass by. So once we have more investment in the infrastructure of conservation, you have the numbers will quadruple because it is very well maintained. So they need to invest in roads, for example. Most conserved areas lack roads to pass by. They need to invest in areas, in things that people don't remember usually. What happens if there is an outbreak of disease? So research and development in understanding not only wildlife behaviors, for example, and relationship or interaction between human and wildlife that usually cause a lot of human-wildlife conflict. The government need to invest in that. And then in return, you have these members of communities hire the villagers. We call them village game scouts in most of these areas to be part of the conservation equation. Yeah. You can have game scout, game rangers from wherever you want, that they are a force, but always remember, in these communities, they have Samburu people, for example, in Kenya, Maasai in Tanzania, you name it. In every part of Africa, there are those indigenous people present in those places. Government need to consider always hiring some of these young people, training them, so skill development, and as investors come, they work with the communities, not only in lodging or transportation business or guiding businesses. You really create this synergy that is beautiful, good for conservation, but good for sustainable conservation, and also utilization become a shared equation for both the members of community, government, and investors.
Because Because why I ask you this question is the fact that some people have seen it as a chicken and egg situation. What should come first? Should we create an environment where we have a beautiful game reserve, or a beautiful lodge that we start first with that, and then the tourists that will come will now be able to generate some money that will now deal with the problems of the people? Or should we first look at the challenges of the people living around these beautiful lodges or these beautiful game reserves, and then now design products that are catering or answering to those particular challenges? What should come first?
And old wisdom, it is always people, second priority people, third priority people, even a thousandth priority people. So usually you focus on the communities. Who are they and why are there wildlife less? For example, in the Masai Mara, and there are no wildlife in London, because the people in this ecosystem have been part of the conservation equation. They have in their DNA conservation arrangement within them. So it is important to look at how do we sustain their livelihood, and then how do we encourage, however they have been living, to continue to be part of this conservation equation. And then second point is, once the area is sustainably conserved, you can bring anything. People can go to a place even without having a single lodge. They can have easy tent and sleep. So if you have friendly environment, if you have people who are dedicated to conserve some of these species as their own, you will always bring tourists, because investors will be interested in number one, in an area that is beautiful, bona fide, conserved, and these are the areas that you don't find in most part of the world. You go to China, you wouldn't find tarangire, for example. They are very rare, and the demand for these wild species and wild places will continue to increase as the world population increases. Africa has that unique opportunity. So if the governments and the policymakers across Africa, both in national government as well as in local communities and local governments, would continue to invest, one, in making sure that they build the sustainable tourism and conservation infrastructure. Secondly, training their own people to be part of this equation. And thirdly, making sure that the tax regimes are not what is there for me as a government. Invest first, see the number grow, and then you can reap the benefit. For example, in Tanzania today we have over 25% of the foreign earning exchange from tourism. This is larger than gold that had bypassed tourism. So as you see the numbers increase, you really need to focus on how do you protect not only those core conserved areas, but also the shared ecosystem, and secondly, the wildlife migration, because they continue to live. These wildlife are not people. They move, and then the problem we are seeing now, not only in Tanzania but other places, is the wildlife corridors are closing down. People are farming across those conserved areas, and then wildlife are changing behavior. So if elephants do change behavior, they become a little bit timid, they become aggressive, and then you see increasingly more and more wildlife-human conflict that continue to damage or kill people, and this causes some harmony to disappear that has been there in the past.